we appreciate everyone coming out today for this the town hall meeting for the Peninsular Dam removal. And so we appreciate, I've seen some faces virtually, so seeing people in person. Some of you a little taller, a little shorter than I thought, but it's always cool to see everybody in person. So just real quickly, just so you all know what's going to take place before I turn it over to Councilmember Steve. We're going to do just a brief history of the project for those. We won't make any assumptions that people know what this project is about. So we do want to give just the history of how we got here. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk a little bit about the community report, or just a little bit of a feedback, of a crossover of what some of the community feedback was. Then from there, we will have a presentation on the sediment report, as well as the restoration plan, and then we will open up for public comment. In order to just make sure, when I come back later for public comment, I am going to pass around a clipboard. If you are interested in having to say a few words during public comment, I would like for you all to just to make sure you sign up. So you'll see a clipboard that's going around for you all to be able to sign up if you would like to say a few words. If you don't sign up and the spirit moves you, and you want to come a little later, we will have an opportunity to still open up for you all to ask or just make comments during the public comment section. All right, so we all good? So we're going to wait. We're going to have all the presentations, and then we will have open comment at that point in terms of comments, conversation, question. We want to make sure that we get through the content first before we actually have public comments within the presentation. Everybody good? Let's try one more time. Everybody good?
Good.
All right. We'll turn it over to Councilman Steve. It's on you.
Thanks, Summer. I'm Steve Wilcox. I'm a city council person from Ward 2. I've been running point on this for about 3 years. My first council meeting was the night that the Princeton Hydro feasibility study was presented. So I'm going to give, like you said, I'm going to give you a brief history of the dam project. So we had previous public meetings on this, starting in 2017, with presentations from the Watershed Council and lots of other notable meetings with subject matter experts. Two things to highlight were the Princeton Hydro Feasibility Study, which was presented in December of 2018. And then we had another town hall in February of 2019 before council deliberated on the dam. At that previous town hall, there were about 75 to 100 people that showed up. Subsequent to that, we released a survey to get people's preferences on the options for the dam. Residents and non-residents participated in that survey. There were about 175 respondents. Of that, just over 70% favored removal of the dam. A higher percentage said that they never or only occasionally used Penn Park, but in both groups, over 50% of the people said that they would use the park more if the dam was removed. Also from that survey, one of the things that stuck out was that people were interested in having the heritage of the site preserved, and that included the powerhouse and the iconic sign. People gave information about their tradition of fishing by the dam. That they were interested in just that image of the dam, and through that survey, it came out that people wanted to improve the usage of Penn Park by a wider segment of the residents. The Sustainability Commission passed a resolution saying that if we took the dam out, that we should preserve the powerhouse and the sign, and to separate the sign and the dam state. So the rationale for the removal was covered a number of times before the council deliberated on this, and here's just a summary of that. We had subject matter experts from the state and federal level talking about the ecological benefits. Removal of the dam would alleviate the infrastructure liability and relieve the city of a financial burden. Hydropower was addressed, and at the time deemed it economically infeasible due to the high capital of installing the turbines, and in the unfavorable power climate, DT was not giving favorable rates, so we would have had to install a substation to do the delivery of the power. Dam removal was also deemed important in terms of climate change and giving us resiliency to greater increased number of floods, greater rainfall and severe storms, and is likely to reduce the greenhouse gases as well. So with that, council deliberated on this in May of 2019, and at the time, the estimate for the cost of this was removal was $2.7 million. We voted to allocate $500,000 towards the removal, and so that can be used as matching funds for grants and things like that, but also pursue funding through grant programs. Later in the year, in 2019, another resolution came up. There had been a rumor that the powerhouse would be used for a brew pub and uses like that. So the second resolution was to clear that up and say that the state or the city was only going to use that property, the state-owned or the city-owned property, for recreation purposes, and it wouldn't be put to that kind of use. And also to say that the land that was revealed on private property would not be used by the city in any way. So since then, one of the issues that came up is like, who owns the property that's under the water? And so we've engaged the city attorney to get the deeds. We've engaged OHM, our engineering firm, to contract with a title company to find those titles. The first company we enlisted was not able to perform to the capacity that we needed. So we got another one. We've set aside $50,000 for that work, and that is ongoing. Prioritize the parcels for those reviews based on the private property that is along the north side, on both sides of Superior Road, and then the private property that is on the east side of Superior Road during the back. We've secured funding from the Fisheries Habitat Grant Program from the Michigan DNR. The themes there were for aquatic habitat conservation and dam management. Since 2019, we've secured $650,000 in funds for two cycles of that grant. And there's work that is remaining on that funding that will be finished in 2022 and 2023 field season. Previous public engagement in this round, we formed a public engagement committee in May of 2021. They met through the summer. It was comprised of residents, members of the Sustainability Commission, staff, and council members. At that time, we engaged Summer Woods, who you just met, from the Woods Watts Effect to facilitate those meetings. We had 3 events that focused on either landowners, recreationists, or the general public, and those were held in August and September of last year. This town hall was originally scheduled for last fall, but we waited until we had the reports in hand so that it wouldn't just be an empty meeting. We'll have future town halls when we get more information from the next season of studies. In the meantime, we have a landing page at the city that contains meetings, the meeting announcements, the reports. There's a portal for comments that you can make 24/7, and then the grant proposals are there, so you can see the scope of work for those. This is just a graphic of how these projects look over time. The removal feasibility study was completed in 2018. We've moved into the removal design and planning stage, and the restoration planning, and we've been seeking the fundraising and getting community input at meetings like this. We're a long way from getting to the final permitting that will allow us to do the deconstruction, and then the restoration will be happening at the same time. But through the whole time, we're going to be doing environmental modeling. So, but as you can see, this is where we are in 2021, at the end of 2021. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Summer.
All right, thank you. I know just for the speakers coming up, we want to make sure that they can hear to project, because I know our masks sometimes, so just be mindful. I know there's a couple of community members that talked about that, so I'll remove my mask, even though I talk pretty loud, so you should be able to hear me through the mask. But I'm going to so I know it's a little hard for everyone to see back in the back, so I'm going to make sure that I just, speak to more of the narrative. All of the community feedback in terms of all of the notes and the recap and the data, all of that will be posted to the website on Monday. But I'm just going to give you a broad stroke of what that is. A lot of you all were involved in those virtual meetings, so I want to be mindful of the time and get to what we know everyone is interested about is the Sediment Report and the restoration plan. So just a little bit about our company. We are an equity and inclusion consulting firm based in Detroit, Michigan. We focus on equitable approach to different projects, so from a community perspective and also just from internal perspective. A little bit about myself: I have worked on Super Bowl, but also worked on NCAA, a lot of different sporting events or large events that happen, but also infrastructure project. A major one in the city of Detroit, which is the Q line, so very much understand the dynamics of infrastructure and the impact to community and how we got involved. When we talk about equity, we want, I like to do a lot of different quotes just to kind of ground us in how we're doing this work and how to approach it. And this is a quote by Nancy Snow, who says, "Democracy cannot function or survive without a sufficient medium by which citizens remain informed and engaged in public policy debates." And so I say that to say, and we'll get a little bit into the ground rules. We know that this is, we have perspectives on both sides of the equation. We want to make sure that we are getting all the information out regardless, but to make sure that we are rooted within respect and equitable approach to this work. So the purpose of the stakeholder meetings, as Councilmember Steve was saying, was definitely to gather input and feedback from those that were impacted in different demographics, which we'll get a little bit into. Because it was COVID, we did have to host these meetings via virtual. This is the first in-person meeting, so we do want to make sure that we take that information into consideration. But we did invite members of the city of Ypsilanti, Superior Township, and other communities, and it wasn't just residents, it was others that use the waterway. We want to be mindful of that. We know that there is impact not only to residents, but also to non-residents and visitors, and make sure that we are mindful about that. The 3 meetings that were set up, that was, again, it was a mandate to have them virtual by the state as well as with the city. We had one that was August 18th, which was a landowner focus. So a lot of that was making sure that we understood specifically from the landowner their concerns, but also trying to understand some vision. Like, what does it look like from a long-term perspective and the greater impact of the project? August 24th, we met with the recreation users, their focus group, trying to understand how is it being used in terms of fishing or boating, just to make sure we have some different perspectives. And then the last one of the 3 series of meetings was September 28th, where it was a general public meeting. So there were some people, there was a lot of people that came to all 3 meetings, and there were some that kind of switched it up. Our goal was to try to make sure that we had a couple of opportunities from that. What we did learn in one of the meetings as well is that, we wanted to make sure that it was all voices that was included. The reality of it is that engagement, things are important, is all relative. If you're trying to, if you got to work, you have to take care of your kids, you have things to do. So we were intentional. I actually had a conversation with Ann Brown, who was helpful to give a couple of community members to reach out to get their perspective, which was also incorporated into the plan. So when we looked at the process itself, as Councilmember Steve talked about, there was an engagement committee that was made up, and there was a host of different meetings that offered some perspectives of how the actual engagement meeting should go and what the structure of those should look like. And then we also had just other tactical efforts of offline conversations to make sure that we were engaging as much. So I hate this is so small, but I kind of give you just some broad streak of some of the community feedback and being mindful. Some of the stakeholders, in the sense of the 3 focus groups, all agreed that overwhelmingly the Penn Dam and the Peninsular Park were special destinations for the city of Ypsilanti. That was something that resonated across all of the groups, and making sure that those stakeholders, they shared memories, right? People that are from Ypsi, those are not, that live on the land, live off the impoundment as well, talked about that. And then a lot of, some of the stakeholders and landowners had recall times of just paddle boating, fishing, some of the impact of what they thought it would be from that. The other part of that is preserving the heritage of the dam and certain aspects of it with the Peninsular Paper Company, powerhouse building and sign, and that was something was important, that was nostalgic to the community as well. And then looking at just, what would be the potential impact. Some had concerns about how would that impact bird watching. also fishing and boating. There were some concerns about the water in terms of it's a slower pace, right? And there was a concerns with removal of the dam that could change the speed and the motion of the water as well. And then some talks about just the budget. How is this going to be paid, and what did that look like in terms of the restoration plan? Not just the budget, but the restoration. What does that look like? What is the impact for those different community groups? There was concerns about the sediment. What's in the water, right? Everyone has perspectives of what is in there. We heard that there's cars. We heard that there's toxicities. And again, that's what we're here today to talk about a lot of those reports that came in. A couple of members wanted to talk about just alternative power options, to use it as another opportunity not to remove the dam, but looking at alternatives, in which the city has expressed what some of those concerns are as well. But overall, the main thing that we did come to an agreement is that there is attention that is needed for the park as well, in terms of what does that look like long term? How are we able to make sure that when we're thinking about the massive unit and what that is from the water perspective, that is for everybody. We know that different groups have different concerns, but the goal is, what does the restoration plan look like long term, that everybody has an ability to come and fish and bird watch and be at the park and make sure that it's up to the standards of the community. As we talked about, again, it will be a full report. I didn't want to go into every single, those were kind of a recap of some of the concerns, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot of those, but we did want to make sure that we came with more of the results of the report of the sediment as well as the restoration plan. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brendan, who is going to, from Liminal Tech, that is going to talk about the sediment report. And we just got to be mindful they can't really see, so we got to do a little bit more narrative there.
Thank you, Summer. Can everybody hear me okay? Just wave a hand in the back if I pull the microphone too far away and you can't hear me or something. So my name is Brendan Kuzno. I'm a civil and environmental engineer. I work for Liminal Tech. I've been working in this field for about 20 years now. It feels weird to say that, but getting there. And we had three main tasks with this phase of the project. Number one, collect data on the existing bathymetry, detailed bathymetry, as well as depth of refusal. So that's measuring the unconsolidated sediment depth to measure how much has accumulated in the dam since it was constructed or reconstructed in 1918. And then the last one was to sample the sediment, send it to a lab for analytical processes to look at what are the PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, what are the metals, what is the phosphorus content, and then to do some grain size characterization on the sediment itself within the impound. So I'm here to talk about those three items. We teamed with a couple of other firms. Interfluve is a river restoration firm. We've worked with them in several places around the country. They specialize in river restoration. They did the Bathymetric survey and Geomorphic assessment, so I'll talk about the results of those first. So the first is they did a bathymetry survey using a drone, using sonar to measure the depth to the bottom, so it would measure what the top of the accumulated sediment is. See if the pointer works. You can see that the darker blue on the diagram, I think these slides will be available after the meeting if you want to take a look. Darker blue is the lower elevations. You can see where the channel comes in. It's deep around the outside of the bend. There's sediment that has accumulated immediately downstream of where the river comes into the impoundment. You can see that under both of the bridges, under Superior Road and the railroad bridge, it's scoured out because velocities are maintained through there, so it's able to keep pushing sediment under those areas. And then there's immediately downstream of those, there's usually kind of a hump of that sediment. Once it's pushed out, water velocity slows down, it can't carry it any further, it drops it out. Within the impoundment sediment, we saw the coarser materials. So the dots here correspond to the bottom sediment type, whether it's silt or sand, gravel or muck. We saw the coarser sediments drop out first, so those are at the upstream end of the impoundment, as well as immediately downstream of the bridges where it can continue to scour and push through. You end up with some gravel deposited down there. Other than that, it's a very fine, sandy, silty sediment deposited throughout the rest of the impoundment. And then the last thing is the depth of refusal. So this is where we probe the actual sediment until we cannot push a probe further down, so it's refusal. And it's measuring what's unconsolidated, what's just sort of settled there and sat on the top, hasn't been exposed to loads, or it has a glacier sitting on it historically, or been eroded out. What we found is, roughly, I think it's an average of 3+ feet over the impoundment, with some areas up to and a little bit over 5 feet of deposited sediment within the impoundment. Looking at some typical bathymetric sections, so these are going to be from downstream to upstream on the next couple of slides. This is immediately upstream of the dam. This is the park side on my left, on your right. You can see the dashed line down here is the refusal surface. So there's a lot of sediment that's sort of built up on that park side downstream. That was the deepest sediment we measured on the site. But you can see that there's kind of a river channel. The historic river channel has been kept free. That's where a lot of the flow is continuing to push through. Immediately upstream of there, still downstream of the railroad bridge, you can see this is the steep valley wall along the north side, northeast side of the impoundment. And the river channel itself is pushed over right up to the toe of that slope. And that looks like the historical river channel. There is sediment deposited in that area, oftentimes on the inside of the bend. And then this one is immediately downstream of the railroad. Again, there's a fairly steep bank on the outside of the bend, which is not atypical from a geomorphic perspective. Immediately upstream of there, the river section actually widens out. It's a much shallower valley, not as steep slopes upstream of the railroad bridge. That would be more analogous to sort of a cross-section, valley cross-section that we see down in downtown Ypsilanti, just down here at Frog Island Park, where it's a much broader valley with the river channel not directly up against the steep valley walls. And then going further upstream of Superior Road, it's similar to that cross-section with a sort of a broader section, but not quite as wide as in the middle section of the impoundment. So these are some of the comparison cross-sections. This is at Frog Island Park, so you can see that it actually compares geometrically fairly well. And this is reference cross-section number 12, which is, I believe it's actually just out our doors right up here. So the results of that showed how much sediment that we have built up in there. So the total sediment volume that has been deposited since the dam was constructed is about 280,000 cubic yards. The initial estimates from the feasibility survey had said up to 1 million. This is kind of the lower end of that range, but given the level of data that we've been able to collect here, we feel like we've sort of bracketed the amount of sediment that is within the impoundment that would need to be managed in the event of dam removal. The excavation volume to get a river channel alone through there would need to be removing about 60 or 70,000 of those cubic yards. That doesn't include any of the floodplain benches, but that's just the river channel itself. So we'll touch on that in a little bit later. And looking at the reference sections, what we looked at downstream, basic river geometries that would be more or less naturally formed under these flow conditions. Average bankful width of 129 feet, so that's the top of the bank before it starts to access the floodplain. Average bankful depth of about a little over 4 feet. Once we had the bathymetry and the sediment depths, we moved on into hydraulic model development. And this is a preliminary hydraulic model because we weren't doing design as a part of this phase. We were using the design that was prepared as a part of the feasibility study. So please bear that in mind. And this was done by AECOM. They're a national engineering firm that we work with in several places. They performed the model development and did the scour assessment for the two bridge foundations. So we'll cover that real quick. So the model was developed in HEC-RAS, which is developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's a pretty standard hydraulic model used for flood protection and prediction of your floodplain areas around the country. The downstream end of it is right down here. Actually, I think we're sitting right there, so it ends just down at the 4th Street Bridge here. And it goes upstream to the Superior Dam, upstream of the upstream end of the impoundment. These are some of the typical cross sections. The bathymetry that was used for the existing conditions model. You can see the dam itself here is this impoundment. You can see we used the bathymetry data that we collected. On the bottom, used USGS LiDAR data to define the ground surface outside of the impoundment. These are some cross sections of the Superior Road Bridge. You can see the opening. There's a long causeway to the north on that bridge. This is the dam weir section itself. This is where the powerhouse would sit. And then this is the railroad bridge. You can see there's two piers, and then there's abutments at either end. Again, a long embankment that prevents any flow from passing through that portion. So only small openings here. And then we use some reference cross sections that I mentioned to try to develop what the potential cross section of that stream is going to look like in the future. This is going to have to be refined as the design progresses, but this is what was used to get a good idea of what the generic cross section is going to look like so that we can calculate the velocities and the scour to look at the potential impact for erosion at the bridges themselves. The cross section that we used in the river section, 125-foot bankfull width, so very similar to that 129-foot average. It's a 2-to-1 side slopes, and then a 250-foot wide floodplain bench. So that's this portion here. On either side of the channel, there would be a floodplain that could access when the river gets high, similar to the natural processes that already occur. And so this is an example cross section where this is in pink, you've got the existing data defining the cross section, and then in here is the cross section that's defined in the model, just to, again, primarily to look at what the impacts of scour are at the bridges. This will need to be refined further as the design progresses, but this is a pretty good approximation of the conditions of this. You'll notice that it does not include removal of everything. The floodplain bench is trying to approximate what the area that will be flooded on a regular basis. It isn't necessarily to create floodplain out of areas that were probably upland areas historically, but now that the dam has raised the water level, are currently underwater now. The conceptual modeling was based on the concept design from the feasibility study. The plans are in the feasibility study. I believe that's available for download. And then looking at what the post-dam removal geometry is of the dam. Again, we left this side of the dam in place to look at what would happen if we left that powerhouse in place. That would still remain as an obstruction. And then the potential for bank protection on the other side, particularly where there's development, et cetera. So more or less, it was removing the dam in the center of the channel there, across the 100-foot, I think it's about 120 feet wide at that section. The results of the model, we were able to match what the FEMA flood protection criteria were for the 100-year flood under the existing conditions, so we're pretty sure we're modeling it correctly. And then when we remove the dam, the 100-year water surface actually comes down, which isn't that much of a surprise because we no longer have a dam holding it up all the way up. You can see at the upstream end, it's only a little bit, but at the downstream end, we remove it basically the full height of the dam itself. It comes down that far. So that means there would be some areas within the dam impoundment right now that are not in the future floodplain. And in particular, there was a building that appears to show that it is within the existing floodplain, just downstream of the park on the north side, that under future conditions, it's no longer in the floodplain. You know, that goes down. The river valley, in particular downstream of the railroad bridge, looks very similar to what the river valley is immediately downstream of LaForge Road. It's a very narrow, constrained valley around the river itself. So the conclusions are, number one, we were able to match the existing conditions with the FEMA floodplain maps very closely. Potential future shows that there's a reduction in the floodplain elevation. And then we really do converge, you know, there's very little change further downstream of the LaForge Road Bridge itself.
we're doing questions at the end.
We're doing questions
Keep all
at the
your
end.
questions to the end.
This is a clarification question about your presentation.
Yep, so again, we can keep the questions to the end, so you can just write the clarification and we'll get to that at the end. So we can just report everything out.
Okay, I appreciate having a little extra time then.
Okay?
Thank you. So the other piece of this that was evaluated was looking at the potential for scour at the two bridge foundations. So the two bridges that cross at our Superior Road that was built by the Washington County Road Commission, and then the historical railroad bridge, which was built in the early 1900s. And the concern is that if you have a flood, you can end up with high velocities in this constrained river section, and you want to make sure that you don't scour any of the sediment that is supporting the foundations for those structures. Those are the pile-supported structures, but you don't want to end up scouring below the actual foundation level itself. So the question is, will we need to construct scour protection using larger sediment, stone, riprap protection to prevent the river channel from scouring down at those locations? So the two crossings of the Superior Road Bridge, there's the picture of it shown there, and the historic railroad bridge. And as a part of this, we reviewed the documentation. And on the Superior Road Bridge, there's very good documentation. It was built recently enough that the plans showed the actual depth of the foundation. We were able to compare the predicted scour depth with those foundations and say that, you know, we are going to need some scour protection in order to construct through there. With the railroad bridge, at this point, there is no data. The plans don't exist for the actual bottom of the footing elevation. However, as a conservative estimate, it looks like it would go down that far, and we believe scour protection is going to be required at both of those bridges. So moving on into the sediment sampling. So first of all, I just want to cover why are we sampling the sediment. You can see this is one of the cores that we pulled out of the impoundment. We're trying to evaluate whether there are pollutants present in the sediment that can harm either the public health or the natural ecosystem. This isn't as it's not a preventative measure to say you can or cannot proceed. It's to inform how you would manage that sediment in the future if the dam removal proceeds. So we need to know what's in there in order to design an accurate sediment management plan and prepare for the consequences of dam removal if it's done. We have 33 sampling locations within the impoundment. That exceeds the requirement of the Michigan Eco Guidelines, WRT 048. We were looking at laboratory analysis, looking for the Michigan 10 metals, arsenic, barium, cadmium, chromium, copper, lead, selenium, silver, zinc, and mercury, as well as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. I'm not even going to read the whole list there, but this is the standard suite of PAHs that we test for, as well as looking at the phosphorus content and the moisture content, looking at potential for groundwater migration through there, and to try to understand if this is released, if it's released, what could be the potential impact in terms of phosphorus loading downstream. When we were comparing the results with the criteria, there's a couple of different criteria we were using, one for public health protection and one for ecosystem protection. They're different. For public health, we are looking at what the criteria are for upland restoration, and this is part 201 of the Michigan Natural Resources Act. We need to look at what the hazardous substance is, and we compare it with the cleanup criteria defined in Public Act Part 201. If it does not meet that specifically, there is another caveat, and this flow chart is adapted from Michigan Eco criteria, that you need to look at what the background concentrations of those, each pollutant or each metal or each PAH is, and what the background levels are in the soil based on your region within the state. If it doesn't exceed that, then you would end up down here. Concentration meets the background. If it does exceed that, then concentration exceeds the criteria. That's for public health. For the ecosystem restoration, what we're looking at are the criteria for predicted effects concentration for aquatic environment. And that's primarily going to apply where the river channel is still in place in the future. It doesn't apply to all of the upland. This is going to be the overriding criteria for the upland. In general, the upland criteria are higher than the criteria for aquatic life, and that's because as these are really looking at soil in a residential area. I don't actually live in the dirt, unlike the bugs and the macroinvertebrates. They actually live in the dirt, so they are very sensitive to pollution within the sediment itself. So we look for the river channel sediment quality guidelines based on the EGLE, Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes Energy, and looking at the probable effects concentration, which is the level at which you would expect to see effects in these aquatic organisms. So these are the results for the human contact, the public health protection criteria. There are 2 samples where we had different pollutants exceed the public health criteria. One here at sampling location D03, at arsenic with a concentration of 23.3. The background criteria is considered 22.8 milligrams per kilogram. In addition, at C02, this is right at the edge of the future river channel, there was one of the PAH species which measured concentration was at 2380. Criteria is 2000 for public health cleanup under the Part 201 certification. Other than that, the samples met the public health. And when I'm looking at this one, I'm primarily looking at what's in the green. Obviously the river alignment may change as the design progresses, but this is what's going to rule when we're out in that upland category. When we're looking at the ecological sediment quality criteria exceedances, there were a number more exceedances, primarily related to metals, though there were 2 where there were PAHs as well. And then one where PAHs were the only exceedance up at the upstream end. I think it's C02 was the one up the front one. And that was the one with the highest concentrations of PAHs on the project. So our conclusions are, number 1, there are no public health impacts that cannot be managed. None of these are toxic waste dump site levels. That isn't to say that they don't need to be managed, but none of these are unmanageable. Total volume of the sediment, with the feasibility study noted up to 1,000 cubic yards. Here our bathymetry and depth of refusal survey shows that we're at 280,000 cubic yards, so it really constrains that. Looking at the excavation volume required for the floodplain benches and the channel itself, that's about 135,000 cubic yards. Moving forward, the pollutant levels in the management plan are going to need to be prepared along with the channel design and restoration with the dam removal itself. It's going to need to take into account the locations where the sediment samples exceeded criteria, both for ecological restoration as well as public health restoration. There's going to need to be measures taken to remediate that. Some of the things that are going to be considered, I assume manage in place, removal to adjacent uplands, removal to other offsite reuse. Most of this sediment actually did meet criteria so that it could be reused in some other site on upland areas, or removal to landfill, and that may be the option in areas where you ended up with the highest results, where you can't reuse it in other upland areas. So, project status, first phase of the MDNR Fisheries Grant has been completed. The next phase, currently HRWC is accepting proposals on that. That's going to include geotechnical analysis of the dam itself and the bridges, looking at the loading capacity of the soils, the potential for seepage and instability in the soils, additional hydraulic modeling, and the design of the actual removal and channel restoration itself, which is going to go hand in hand with hydraulic modeling. And then pursuing permits and easements, so continued engagement with the regulatory agencies. Ultimately, they're going to be the ones who sign off on any